Hello, Internet. Evan Benton of Dogg here. I came upon some data points this week that I think are going to allow me to put forward a working theory of what is going on with coronavirus slash COVID-19 historically. Now, keep in mind this is going to be speculative and not conclusive, and I just chomping at the bit to get this information out here. So I'm going to make a little video just going through my stack of books that I've been referring to come up with this theory and put it out here to the world and hopefully get some feedback and see if anyone has any links to follow up on for me. Okay, so I'm going to start back in the 19th century with the works of Dr. Antoine Béchamp, who published in French as he was. I've got these, and I haven't made my way through them because they're in French, but this is his work on the theory of, let's see if you can see it, microzymes, okay? The microzymes and their relation to heterogeny, histogeny, physiology, and pathology. And so these two works are, I guess, a college textbook basically that he had put together for his students, going through his theory and how to discover them. And what the microzymes are. See, I made a video about Béchamp. You can check out on my channel. But he was the real genius who Louis Pasteur ripped off. Okay, so Louis Pasteur was a total fraud, which means germ theory is a fraudulent theory that is not even, it's not internally consistent. Okay, and that's what we've been dealing with for about 150 years, and this is the real truth, and that is that he discovered these things called microzymes, and this is a microzyme, probably like 1,000 times magnification. The other book has probably a better picture. You can see they look basically like what they're telling us are viruses. Okay, and just like these pictures of viruses we've seen, you can't tell a lot from this picture. Okay, so you can't use optical microscopes to learn much about these things. And so in these books, he talks about the techniques he used, and basically he was able to determine that they exist by measuring their enzymatic output. So these little things, microzymes, what they are basically are they're tiny particles that a single cell breaks down to when it quote unquote dies, and they're able to they're very resilient. They're able to break down starches into sugars, thus proving that they're alive. And they're able to reform under certain circumstances into any number of different types of bacteria or fungi. So, the whole idea of different species of microorganisms is probably, well, it's at least called into question by this man's work. I have another book by Dr. Marie Non-Clerc, which is just a biography of Antoine Béchamp. Again, I haven't made it through this one yet. This one's from 1985. So, and that's the dude there with all his cool medals. But this one I'm almost done with, and this is actually in English. So another great picture of the microzymes. The blood and its third anatomical element is the title in French. And this is just going through his work on how blood clots, and he details how it is these microzymes in our bloodstream that play a crucial role in the ability of blood to flow and then to eventually clot if that flow is disrupted in some way. So that's really where we're at in terms of a theory of biology, and that is something that hardly any scientist knows about. As I mentioned, these books are only available in French, so I'm going to be working to translate them. That's going to be a long-term work for me because my French is not great, but that's going to be cool. So going from the 19th century to the 1950s, this book, Lab 257, details, of course, starting with the Nazis, a germ warfare project that existed in the United States on the island of Plum Island in the Long Island Sound, I believe. And this is where Lyme disease comes from. So Lyme disease was bred here. It wasn't created here, but it was bred here and introduced into the bodies of ticks, and then they escaped somehow. Either they escaped or there was an act of sabotage that let them loose in the years 1968 and 1975. There are two separate outbreaks as far as anyone can tell. And then from 1968, well, from the 1951 is when the Plum Island Research Facility was opened. So, but we've got these other books here, Dr. Mary's Monkey, the main two, Dr. Mary's Monkey by Edward Haslam, and Me and Lee by Judith Berry Baker. I've mentioned these in my first video on the coronavirus. These talk about a germ warfare laboratory located here in New Orleans at Tulane University and at the Ochsner, what was then called the Ochsner Institute. And the goal of that project was to develop a cancer virus, which could be used in covert assassinations. And then she goes, so the cool thing about these two books is this guy, Edward Haslam, who was a student at a Jesuit high school here in New Orleans, that comes in later, Jesuit. Judith Berry Baker was a participant in these experiments. She was a young scientist working on this stuff. So they corroborate each other in stunning ways. This guy is looking at just independently. She is an eyewitness. This book is an eyewitness. It's got a lot of interesting documents reproduced in it, but basically it's her story. So take it or leave it. Personally, I am inclined to believe it. And of course, the subtitle, How I Came to Know, Love, and Lose Lee Harvey Oswald. So that is how the whole germ warfare thing connects to the Kennedy assassination in the person of Lee Harvey Oswald. And also, if these writers can be, well, I think a lot of people are saying this, the district attorney at the time of New Orleans was studying some people in New Orleans for their possible ties to the Kennedy assassination. His name was Jim Garrison, and the big guy he was looking at was Dr. Alton Ochsner, the founder of the Ochsner Institute, who had huge ties to the CIA, I'm learning, and he was the person who put forth the tobacco cancer theory. So, and that's looking to me like that was really just a big cover up for what they knew about cancer and what they were trying to, distract people with this red herring that tobacco causes cancer. I'm not saying that tobacco is great to smoke. And in fact, one of the interesting things about the tobacco plant is that it takes up radioactive material from the soil. So when they're using radioactive fertilizer, or if there's fertilizer in the ground, it's going to end up in the tobacco plant, and you're going to end up smoking it into your lungs. And little aside there, they do use radioactive material to fertilize tobacco plants. I don't know why. I have to go back to my first pile of books here because I remembered an aside I forgot to make. So back to Béchamp and the microzymes. A big question is, what is the infective capability of these microzymes, of these tiny virus-like particles? Okay, the answer is very little. It's going to be very hard for these things to come into your body and cause mischief, because they're only really capable of creating enzymes, and then what they do is they link together and they form bacteria and such under specific conditions. So in that sense, they can definitely cause problems. So, for example, according to the microzyme theory, what's going on when you have something like tetanus, for example, is you get a puncture wound into your foot, and then that causes cell death inside that puncture wound, and it's cut off from the atmosphere. Then it's inside of your foot, and your blood isn't able to get to it, and the air isn't able to get to it. So it's got a nice environment for those microzymes. Your cells, as they rupture and die, they release their microzymes. They revert to their microzymian state, and then in the microzymian state, in the presence of the stuff that used to be in your cells, they digest it and they combine together, like a ring of like a string of pearls, until they eventually go blorp and turn into some kind of a bacteria, and then they're able to secrete some sort of toxin that is able to further break down the cells in your foot, for example, or cause septicemia and things like that. So, but another aside that I can't really get into in this video is that another implication of that is really the infectious potential for any pathogen is pretty dang low, and specifically in regards to, coronaviruses, which don't exist in the first place. Airborne particles, I guess I should say. In regards to airborne particles, the ability for them to infect someone has never been demonstrated really conclusively. So, especially if you're asymptomatic, that's just crazy idea that got made up, basically. So, yeah, I forgot to mention as well, I don't have notes for this video. I'm just going off of the stack of books method. So there are no such thing as viruses, according to Dr. Béchamp in his work. Viruses are microzymes. They're just, so the reason that you find microzymes the reason that you find viruses when a person is sick is not because the viruses are infecting the person. It's because the viruses are what's left of the cells after the person has been damaged by whatever kind of disease process. So that is a huge misunderstanding that almost all doctors, subscribe to. And I'm sure if any real doctor watches this video, he's gonna think I'm ridiculous. But the evidence is right here, and I can get into later when I talk about this book, which I should do soon. I can talk about how he actually went about finding these microzymes and excluding the potential for contamination of his samples from what he was working with. Okay, so he submitted these little buggers to alcohol baths. He submitted them to carbolic acid to exclude the air, right? So there was no possibility of atmospheric contamination of his samples, and yet they still persisted, and they were capable of turning starches into sugars, which he was able to measure. So we're at the Kennedy assassination and the relationship between that and a top secret cancer virus assassination program that was being undertaken by the United States military, etc. And the big thing there that I've found this week is connected to this book, Project Daylily, and you can see a little swastika there. That's 10 points to the first person who mentions the Nazis, I think, is where we're at in our current cultural milieu. Okay, Garth Nicholson is the doctor here. This book is written as a fiction. It's a fictionalized account of what happened with all this stuff. And so I was kind of put off when I learned that, and this book has just been sitting on my shelf for a while, to be quite honest with you. But this guy was a researcher, and he started this book in conjunction with Gulf War syndrome, which unfortunately affected his daughter, who was in the U.S. military and came down with it. And he found that there was something called a mycoplasma that was responsible for this Gulf War syndrome, and that so not only were the service members who were affected by Gulf War syndrome, having these symptoms, but their families were having these symptoms. Okay, so service members were contracting Gulf War syndrome, and they were passing Gulf War syndrome on to their families. I had no idea that was the case, but there's plenty of evidence here. And not only that, but there is apparently a patent for this Mycoplasma fermentans something that was issued to the United States military some time ago. Okay, so that's kind of the next step after the Kennedy assassination. But another guy that I just found this week is Donald W. Scott. He wrote a book called The Brucellosis Triangle, and he was an editor of something called the Journal of the Degenerative Diseases. The Journal of Degenerative Diseases, which was published by the Common Cause Medical Research Foundation. And this does not have a strong online presence. And this Dr. Scott unfortunately died in 2011. Nicholson is still alive, so hopefully I'll get contact with him. But through the Journal of Degenerative Diseases, they put out a 4-part expose linking the Kennedy assassination and that germ warfare program up to AIDS and to these mycoplasmas and the brucellosis. So, and that apparently that has been reproduced in a book called AIDS: The Crime Beyond Belief. So I guess that is my next step, is looking up that book. But so the problem now with this stuff, with these two guys, Scott and Nicholson here, is so I can't tell whether or not the mycoplasma is referring to a very small bacterium, as certain people and Wikipedia say, or whether it is a virus-like particle, as Dr. Scott says. So if it's a virus-like particle, as I mentioned earlier, it cannot exist, and that is a very big problem for that theory. And supporting that sort of interpretation is that these guys, as you can tell from the name Common Cause Medical Research Foundation, are theorizing that this mycoplasma, this teeny tiny, the smallest bacterium or a virus-like particle, are the cause of so many illnesses: AIDS, cancer, fibromyalgia, multiple sclerosis, I think, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, just a crazy, crazy list of different things. And, so what it seems like to me is just that they're finding these things, they're finding these mycoplasmas because cells are undergoing cell death in these conditions, and they're finding the remains of the cells. So that probably doesn't come across well in what I'm saying here, but kind of just take my word for it unless you want to read this stack of books that I've gone through here. Okay, so long story short, then, this is going to be my theory. Okay, this is what is going on with COVID-19 slash coronavirus. All right, so in New Orleans, well, starting before that, starting along the East Coast from Fort Detrick and Plum Island, starting during World War II and shortly after World War II, but culminating in New Orleans in 1963 at Tulane University and the Ochsner Institute, and people such as Dr. Alton Ochsner and Dr. Mary Sherman. There was a secret program to develop a cancer virus, okay? And there was a bit of a political battle to get this cancer virus out, or they were going to kill President Kennedy. That's what this book says. They were going to either use it to kill Fidel Castro, or they were going to kill President Kennedy the old-fashioned way. And what happened is they claimed that they got the virus out, or they claim that they got a working version of the virus out and tested it on an inmate. They speculate actually on multiple inmates, but for some reason it was not in time to have to prevent the assassination of President Kennedy. So maybe that was just a ruse all along to get these guys to light a fire under their butts to get this developed as soon as possible. But the fact of the cancer virus is that it did require a biological, a radiological, and a chemical component to finally kill the inmate, or in previous generations, the monkeys, or in previous generations, the mice that they were testing it on. Okay, so they injected this person or people with this virus, what they called a virus, but they also submitted them to massive doses of X-rays, and they also injected them with some immunosuppressive drugs. Okay, so it wasn't just that they had a cancer virus that you could inject into anybody, and 2 weeks later they would die. Okay, it took a lot of coordination amongst at least 3 different medical personnel. Okay, and that was the case. That was the plan with the Castro assassination. Lee Harvey Oswald was going to deliver this thing, the biological part of it, in a thermos, an insulated thermos, to his Cuban counterparts, and he was going to instruct them in the other 2 parts of it. They would have to get Fidel in for like an X-ray, and then just turn the X-ray machine on for a little longer than they would need to. Okay, and then they would have to inject him with something else, and it was this 3-part process that would kill. And so, long story short, it didn't work. They failed to produce a cancer virus because, first of all, viruses do not exist. What we think of as viruses are really, as called by Dr. Béchamp, microzymes, or microzymas in French, and they are the remains of a cell. They are not an infectious particle, so they don't have any potential to infect. So they ended up with this program, and they said, well, we failed, but we have all this data. So what we can do with this data is we can trick people into thinking we were successful. And that was AIDS. AIDS was a hoax or a fraud that these people, like a lot of well-meaning doctors now believe was the result of this massive super scary depopulation program, right? A killer biological weapon, and it never has existed, and it never will existed. And indeed, the implications of my research are that the potential for such a bioweapon to exist are thankfully very, very limited. So we do not live in that weapon of mass destruction world that we've been told that we have lived in, since the invention of the atomic bomb, etc. So that's great. But yeah, so I've now linked the Kennedy assassination to the AIDS virus, and what that was this this bioweapon program that failed, but resulted in so much data that they could just put out all this, just kind of hit people with this like snowstorm of all this data, and you would take so long to sift through it. And also, it would give them evidence of these secret government programs because, of course, there was this secret government program. So, that's what happened, in my opinion. And so, remember first of all, the next step was the invention of the PCR test in, I believe, 1981 by Dr. Carey Mullis, and that was a little piece of laboratory equipment that allowed them to multiply any tiny little piece of genetic information, into millions and billions of copies. And so they could take anything and, make people believe that it was millions or billions of times more significant than it was. And also, just because of the way that it works, because of the way that it multiplies things, it introduces error into the multiplication process. And you end up, as Kerry Mullis said in a video I just watched by him, you end up with the idea, the sort of Buddhist notion, I believe he said, that everything is contained in everything else. And he was a sort of Buddhist, so he believed that. But I think what was really happening is just the process was introducing error, and so you test something long enough, and finally you get what you're looking for. So the PCR process enabled them to create evidence of HIV and AIDS without ever linking it to the symptoms, but to at least say that it exists, and it exists in a significant way in terms of the patients. So that is where we are at. And who was it who was the point man for HIV/AIDS? Well, it was Dr. Anthony Fauci. So crazy connection there, but obviously, and he is a Jesuit. So we have another connection there with that group. Tulane University I don't think they're linked to the Jesuits, but Loyola University obviously is named after Saint Ignatius of Loyola, and Tulane and Loyola are right next to each other. So they have to be hanging out basically. So that is my theory. They started trying to develop a bioweapon. They realized after some time that they couldn't ever create a bioweapon, but they could trick people into thinking they had created a bioweapon. And the purpose of AIDS was to purge the entire scientific community. And so what they did is they put out this theory of AIDS, of HIV causing this AIDS, and any scientist who disagreed with them basically lost funding. Okay, and the next generation that came along, they all had to subscribe. They had to write their papers saying how much they believed in this theory, or they wouldn't graduate, so on and so forth. And then, well, almost 40 years later, after the scientific community has been extensively populated by people who subscribe to the HIV/AIDS hypothesis, subscribe to the validity of the PCR test as a means of diagnosing viruses, which Dr. Mullis said was impossible. And now they have the blueprint to defraud the entire population of planet Earth into believing that there is a massive pandemic. So that is my theory. Share this, and please comment, if you have any links to something that I could follow up on, or if you have any challenges to my speculative theory here, feel free to hit me with them down below in the comments, or send me an email. And as I mentioned, I got a lot of books I need to buy, so if you could help me out with a little donation, that would be great, and that would help me to put out more content just like this. So this has been Evan Benton with Dogg from Air. Thanks for watching, and have a good day.